a little presentation. Abigail got her master's degree in medieval Britain and Europe in 2016 at Aberystwyth University, Wales. And now she is PhD student at Aberystwyth University with an interest in Anglo-Norman social and political culture. And the title of her report today is Not My Abbot, Monastic Disobedience in Orderic, Vitalis, Historia, Ecclesiastica. Now, Abigail, thank you again for your participation, and please, you have 20 minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Noswaith from Wales. Just going to get started. My PowerPoint's not working, so I'm just going to have to talk at you, but I'm more than happy to share my slides with you afterwards if you would like them. So disobedience exists in every community, and as much as it's hoped that they will, not everybody will abide by the rules. Monastic communities in the Middle Ages were no different. Each monastic house had its share of disobedient monks. What constituted disobedient behaviour for the Benedictine communities, and in the examples given in Orderic Vitalis's Historia Ecclesiastica, developed from adaptations of the original rule set out by St. Benedict of Nursia. Within the rule as it stood in the 12th century, the classification of punishment was twofold, distinguishing only between lesser faults and more serious offences. Monks who misbehaved for a minor offence were excommunicated, which usually resulted in the offender being excluded from the communal meal. For more severe offences, the excommunication extended to the oratory. If a monk continued to commit an offence, the severity of the reprimand also grew, with corporal punishment and expulsion from the abbey as possible punishments. Within the Benedictine rule, a slight reaction by a monk when reprimanded or assigned a task was reason enough for punishment. It was also not unknown for a monk to fall asleep at matins, to overindulge at mealtimes, or to consume a little bit too much to drink. These errors and misjudgments were relatively small offences, and correcting their behaviour would be the first step to avoid more punishment. It is when disobedience reaches unforgivable and unatonable levels that piques my interest. What acts must a monk have committed to face arguably the harshest of monastic punishments, excommunication and expulsion from their abbey? Who are these exiled monks, and why is a discussion of them important to our understanding of society in the 11th and 12th centuries? This paper is based on my preliminary thoughts on a concept of an exiled existence in the Middle Ages, which is the focus of my thesis. I'd like to argue that a monk, using the language often used by 12th century Anglo-Norman writers, had already abandoned the world to take monastic orders, and can therefore be seen as an example of a social exile. Within my research, I have identified a number of exiled forms that appear within the Historia Ecclesiastica, and a few of these examples include political exiles, refugees, those who've been excommunicated, spiritual self-exile, cases where the language suggests rejecting or abandoning the world to enter a monastery or a hermitage, and spiritual forced exile, most notably child oblates, a practice later banned in the 13th century. Within my parameters, I have focused on individuals who relocated across borders away from their homeland, either by choice or due to external factors, and also individuals who'd been removed from their communities. Things become a little more complicated, however, when a monk is then expelled from an abbey due to bad behaviour. Where in society does somebody sit if they had abandoned the world they first knew and were then expelled from the monastic world? Would a monk be able to return to life outside the cloister? I'm hoping that in my talk today, and for my wider research, that I trigger more questions on what the exiled state of an individual may have meant in the Middle Ages, by looking beyond the traditional geographical boundaries of what constituted an exile to look at social possibilities. In this paper, I'll use the example of the expelled monk and question whether it would truly have been possible for a monk to leave an abbey and return to their pre-monastic life. To explore this in more detail, my primary focus is on the Historia Ecclesiastica of Orderic Vitalis, written in the 12th century at the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Évroult in southern Normandy. The sheer scale of this text, 6 volumes in Marjorie Chibnall's translation of the work, has provided a wealth of stories and exemplars that have helped to shape the core ideas of my focus. Today, I want to look specifically at the cases of disobedient monks that occurred under the abbacy of Abbot Thierry, the first abbot of the refounded community at Centreville between 1050 and 1057. I have selected examples from this time in the abbey's history due to the difficulties that Thierry encountered in motivating his new community to abide by the rule, and criticisms that the abbot had faced for being unworldly and exiling the community from the world outside the cloister. Monastic obedience was high on the list of Thierry's values, and he reportedly gave a stark warning to the community about the importance of good works and obeying the rule. Just a block quote here. Only one demon tempts the monk who is active in doing good, but 1,000 demons assault the slothful monk and prick him with so many temptations that he comes to scorn the monastic cloister and longs to see the pernicious sights of the world and experience its perilous delights. You can immediately see here why his contemporaries believed him to be unworldly. Thierry saw the world outside the abbey as dangerous and harmful, suggesting a world full of vices and sin, and believed that a lazy, disobedient monk was an impressionable monk, and therefore a possible blight to the obedience of the community. It's also worth noting that as a general rule, once a monk had taken their vows, they were, as stated by the Council of Toledo in 633, forbidden to return to the world, regardless of whether they had entered the abbey of their own will or by their father's piety. Here we see a complete separation between the world outside and the spiritual world that existed inside Centreville. It's unsurprising then that expulsion from the abbey would have been viewed as an extreme but sometimes necessary punishment. To illustrate this, I'd like to turn my attention to two monks who were expelled from Centreville for very different reasons, and talk about what became of them after they left the cloister. These monks were Romanus and Ansered. Romanus's actions fell more under the traditional definition of the misbehaving monk. Orderic tells us that he was frequently tempted by a demon to steal linen and breeches, and unfortunately for Romanus, was often caught in the act. Each time Thierry rebuked the behaviour of Romanus and pleaded with him to please stop stealing the clothing, the monk responded in the way that he always had, by denying any knowledge of the theft, but making confession shortly after he was caught. One night, the monks were alerted to Romanus's shrieks as he lay in bed, tormented by a demon. The monks were swift to action, shaking their brother and sprinkling him with holy water to free him from his possession. After the demon had departed, Romanus realized that he had allowed the devil to have power over him through his misdeeds and thievery, and he promised his community and his abbot that he would not steal laundry again. Sadly, as Orderic described, a dog will always return to the vomit, and the clothes proved far too tempting for the monk to refrain from stealing. This final act saw Romanus unfrocked and expelled from the abbey. We do not know how old Romanus was, or under what circumstances that he became a monk, but we do know that when he entered the abbey, all worldly possessions would have been left behind and familial relationships severed. Romanus was now being returned to a world that he had not been a part of for some time. It was believed that once he left, he set out on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, though whether he made the journey or took penance is unknown. The suggestion that Romanus may have set out on a pilgrimage, likely to atone for his sins, is another of the exile parameters that I highlight in my research, though is one for a discussion at another time. What Orderic tells us in this retelling is that the expelled monk did not return to Centreville, and this tale is certainly a reminder to future monks and novices of the abbey of what could happen if you disobey orders. For Romanus, after his exile from the abbey, his fate on his return to the world is unknown. The second example is a little more complex when looking at social exile, but is certainly another moral tale for the community. Ansered was a priest who was known to have been lax in his morals. After contracting a severe illness and fearing that death and judgment were close by, Ansered begged for the habit of Centreville as a way to atone for his sins and his sinful life. After a short time in the infirmary, his condition improved. However, his lust for carnal desires and a lack of discipline had not left the priest, despite being so close to death. His dress had changed, but not his way of life. Spending the rest of his time obeying rules was not a priority for the priest, and he soon began to disobey authority, and it wasn't long before he asked his mother and father to reclaim him from the abbey. Abbot Thierry began to fear that Ansered's discontent for monastic life would spread throughout the community. To combat this, the abbot gave permission for the priest to leave his orders, and Ansered's life returned immediately to how it was before he became a monk. The priest, however, following his departure, kept company with common women, and it was this vice that Orderic tells us would ultimately be his downfall. Ansered had agreed to journey to the shrine of St. Giles with one of his women named Rosie. However, when Rosie was not at the agreed meeting place, he went to her lodgings where he found her consorting with a clerk. His intrusion was not welcomed, and the clerk struck Ansered in the head with an axe. After he'd been killed, his body was placed in a sack before being buried in a hole in the ground near to his home. Days later, his body was found and his leg had been lost to wild animals. Orderic lamented the death that the priest had suffered, and in his choice to rather return to worldly vanity than to seek the way to heaven among the servants of God. Here we can somewhat see a justification for Abbot Thierry's view of the world outside the cloister for being pernicious and perilous in the speech that he gave to the community. And Orderic has certainly provided an example as to how disobedience and leaving the relative safety of the cloister could lead to an undesirable end. So was it possible for medieval monks to leave their abbey due to expulsion and then return to the life that they had before they entered the monastery? I think the examples Orderic gives us of Romanus and Ansered have shown that this would have been unlikely. For Romanus, his return into the world left no more than whispers of his misdeeds on the lips of the community, and for Ansered, his vices and lust for the world left him dead soon after his return. However, I want to pose a third social exile that has sat in the periphery of my examples, the abbot that expelled them, Thierry. We know a little more about the abbot than we do the monks. He was described by Orderic as being a little man with a sweet voice and rosy cheeks, and he was commended by Orderic on his actions of handing over appropriate punishment to the worthless sons of the abbey, of which Romanus and Ansered were certainly deemed to be. Thierry's contemporaries, however, were not on the same page as Orderic, who wrote of these affairs half a century later. The more influential monks were not completely happy with how he went about his duty as an abbot, and I'm sure that his having the support of Mabel of Belém, the rival to the abbey's founders, would have had something to do with that. After 7 years as the head of the community, the actions and the disobedience of the monks caused Thierry to realise that there was not anything that he could do at Centreville for the salvation of his community. And he decided that he would once again abandon everything. With permission to leave the abbey granted, he left on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Unfortunately for Thierry, he died on the journey. Though his self-exile from Centreville was not at the result of his own disobedience, but of the actions of those within his community. These monks were frequently pushing their authorities and succeeded in driving out their abbot. I think it's fair to say that Thierry feared the world outside the cloister, and that towards the end of his abbacy, that he possibly began to fear the world within. Self-exile was not punishment in this instance, but disobedience certainly played a part in the abbot's demise. All three of my examples were certainly exiled from the enclosed world at Centreville, though in each case in a very different way. Despite their reasonings, all three individuals had abandoned the world to take orders. For two, disobedience and their own actions saw them being removed from the abbey. Certainly the ideal situation for Ansered, but possibly a blow to the monk Romanus, causing his suspected pilgrimage. For Thierry, the actions of the others were the reason for his departure. Would a monk be able to return to life outside the cloister? It's certainly a difficult question to prove. I think that it's unlikely that a monk would be able to fully integrate back into society, but that does not necessarily mean that it was not possible. I do, however, feel that looking at exiles both within and outside the monastic world is an avenue worth pursuing. These cases are but a small selection of the tales and tribulations that Orderic Vitalis has given us, and lurking within the pages are more social exiles, not necessarily banished from their lands, but those who have abandoned the world for spiritual orders, although the two forms often merge. As Orderic Vitalis himself once said, "I came to Normandy as an exile," and in a way, he and his fellow monks remained exiled from the world for the rest of their lives. Grazie and diolch yn fawr.
So, thank you, very well, wonderful. Thank you, Abby. First of all, you have been perfectly on time, 15 minutes, and so thank you for this. And thank you for your paper about a topic so deeply interesting for me, to me in monastic and Norman studies, with regards to this important community of Center for Normandy, with this link and dialogue between the outside and the inside the cloisters. So I guess there will be a fruitful debate on your paper. So thank you again.